Sandra Gray and I'm the National President of the Tertiary Education Union. Lovely to be here with you tonight. As a group that sees itself as the voice for the tertiary education sector, we have decided this year to launch on a series about the future of tertiary education. And it's in this light that we have brought to New Zealand David Robinson. David is actually the Associate Executive Director at the Canadian Association of University Teachers, and they represent, like us, academic and general staff, but a slightly bigger country, so a slightly bigger membership. They have 66,000 university academic and general staff in their union. But also, and importantly for us, David is actually an advisor to Education International, which is an international trade union federation that the TEU belongs to. This global union federation is actually the largest of all union federations, and it has 30 million teachers and general staff, education support workers, from 171 countries. So we are part of what is a global movement to support and to protect both the staff working in these institutions but public education. Tonight David's going to talk to you about the experiences of staff and students in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. We thought it was well worth talking about this because many of the things that he will talk about around casualisation, change management and some massive changes that happened will seem familiar to all of you here. And there are lessons to be learned. And it is really important that we look across globally. But I do, before I hand over to David, want to mention that we also need to look locally about some of the changes to the workforce occurring in New Zealand. One of the most rapidly occurring changes globally in the tertiary education sector is casualisation of our labour force. And in fact, last night David was talking about the fact that in America 75% of the academic staff are now casual, fixed-term, part-time staff members. In Australia, 60% of teaching is now done by casualised labour. And this has huge impacts for the quality of education, for teaching, for research. But of course, we're not the only workforce where casualisation is now a major issue. And I do want to reflect momentarily and make you turn your thoughts to the workers at AFCO, at Tilly's AFCO plants around the country, and at the ports of Auckland. 1,000 workers in those two disputes, 700 of them locked out by the employer, being asked to accept casualised contracts, and 300 at the ports of Auckland not wanting to go on to contract work. So we share not just with the global sector, but with local workers, this idea that we as workers should be much more flexible. And what that means, in the terms of many of these employers, is that we will work when they demand, at the rates they demand, for the hours they demand, and the months they demand. And I think it is something we need to think about in terms of its effects. So I know David will spark a lot of debate from what he talks about. I do want you to reflect, both as members and those who have come to join us tonight from other unions, but also from across the academic and general staff workforce here in Canterbury. I want you to think about what these trends, what these things that happened in Katrina mean in terms of the impact on public education. And are these really the types of changes we want to see continuing in New Zealand? Does it mean the best for public education, for New Zealand, for workers, for citizens, for family members? So David's going to speak to us for about 20 minutes. So David Robinson.
Thanks very much for the introduction, Sandra. Thanks for the invitation to be here. I'm always saying thank you for rescuing me from a particularly brutal Northern Hemisphere winter. Again, it's nice to have temperatures above freezing. We won't see them in Ottawa for another couple of weeks, or maybe even a few more months. I just want to talk a little bit tonight about how universities and education systems and governments are reacting in post-disaster situations, and something that will be particularly relevant for you. As Sandra mentioned, I'll focus a bit on what happened in New Orleans following Hurricane Katrina in 2005. A fellow Canadian, Naomi Klein, wrote a book a number of years ago called The Shock Doctrine. Some of you may be familiar with it. Essentially, her thesis in this book is that disasters provide an opportunity for various ideological factions to push forward a particular agenda. That in the chaos that follow a disaster, it's much more easy to overcome certain resistance. It's a thesis that I don't agree with 100%, but I think there's some interesting elements in it. But remember back in 2005, Hurricane Katrina was approaching New Orleans. I actually just, almost probably when this picture was taken, I was right around the Florida Panhandle, sort of up by the far right-hand side. Was able to get out just ahead of the first bands of rain that preceded the hurricane. But we all know that the subsequent disaster particularly hit the poorest areas of the city, the lower 9th Ward, predominantly black, extremely poor part of the city. And in so doing, focused a lot of the world's attention on what was then a pretty pathetic response by federal and state authorities to deal with the humanitarian crisis, particularly in the poorest part of the city, but also had some significant consequences for the education system in New Orleans. Now, prior to Hurricane Katrina actually making ground, many schools probably looked not so much unlike this in the lower 9th Ward. It was a particularly underfunded, problematic, crisis-ridden education system. There had been previously a number of proposed reforms and changes that the state government was trying to bring forward, but didn't make much headway. Suddenly, along comes a disaster. The disaster actually wasn't the hurricane. The disaster was the failure of the levees. And in fact, a number of academics had been warning for years that the levees couldn't withstand a serious hurricane. But in any case, the levees broke and the floods washed away much of the New Orleans public education system. And it actually, at the end of August 2005, there was a bit of relief in some quarters because it was a system that had been so seriously degraded over the years. There was hope that there would be a chance now to rebuild the public education system. But within days of the storm, the acting public school superintendent, Ora Watson, declared that the fiscal crisis of the New Orleans public schools was now over. There were a number of hastily assembled meetings, and members of the State Board of Elementary and Secondary Education, and sort of the Board of Trustees, essentially, state and local politicians, and various leaders of the education bureaucracy convened to examine the situation. They also invited representatives of the charter school movement to participate in those discussions. Charter schools are essentially private schools in the United States. So the chance to recreate public education was there, but what happened was it was hijacked. A number of forces came together and made the decision that the public school system would be shut down. The public schools in some of the richer areas of the city opened actually fairly quickly after the hurricane, but in some of the poorer sections of town, they were permanently shut. And they also announced that all 7,500 employees of the public school system would be dismissed, and they were. They were all fired. And that whatever new schools would be open would be charter schools. So it was essentially announcing the end of the public school system. Now, that goal proved a little bit more difficult than what they thought. They did manage to fire everybody, but they couldn't convince enough charter schools to open up. So the school board was actually taken over by something called the Recovery School District, which was an arrangement by which the state government took direct control of the public education system. So everyone had kind of agreed prior to this that public schools, particularly in the lower 9th Ward, had failed, but the solution that was proposed was that of privatization. And also deunionization. This was an attempt to also break the union, which had been resisting some of the changes that some of the ideologues had been proposing. And now, Naomi Klein, if we go back to her book in a minute, she also did a bit of an analysis of what happened in New Orleans following Hurricane Katrina, and found a lot of comparisons to what was happening in Iraq at the same time. That many of the same contractors that had been hired to reconstruct the war-torn country were also being hired to reconstruct the public education system and the infrastructure of New Orleans. Among the vendors who profited in Iraq were many of the same corporations that with mixed results provided government contracted services to disaster-struck New Orleans. For example, Blackwater, I'm sure many of you have heard about, was everywhere in evidence following the days, the days following Hurricane Katrina. At the center of the charter school movement, a number of national associations had set up shop within New Orleans, trying to gain a foothold within the education system. And a number of private companies that were linked to the charter school movement had also set up shop and were involved in some of the reconstructions and cleaning up of some of the schools. But there was a lot of waste and bad judgment that happened at the same time. And part of this is understandable. In the immediate aftermath of a crisis, there's a bit of confusion. We don't know what's happening. But some of the decisions were mind-boggling, to say the least. There was a requirement that, from the federal government, that all schools had to be emptied of all content. So any chairs, computers, whatever. Even if there was no damage. This was a blanket assessment. And then contracts were awarded to companies that had these private contractors to replace the contents. So the same companies threw out perfectly good material and then brought in other material. So the amount of waste and corporate nepotism was just incredible. Hundreds of dollars worth of materials and scores of other schools and around the city were thrown away and replaced. And then once the floodwaters began the school closing, there was an attempt by the state administrators to bypass the elected school board and make some, again, pretty difficult decisions, or difficult to understand decisions. Among them, I already mentioned, was the termination of all employees. And they were terminated with compensation only for the 2 weeks previous that the schools had been closed. So they were given 2 weeks' pay and said, that's it. And in fact, most of the checks arrived about 8 weeks later. The decision to open no school for the academic year appears to be one key in this great experiment of those hostile to public education. The great experiment had begun. It was seat of the pants planning and no community input, and against the objection of only a small number of political, social, and union leaders, the state brought on a new dawn of charter schools. That was the plan. But the National Charter School Movement, think tanks like the Heritage Foundation, a very conservative group in the United States, and the Libertarian or Market Liberal Cato Institute were all championing the success of New Orleans in taking on the unions and taking on public education. In fact, the Cato Institute, one of their senior researchers said, we got rid of the school board. Anyone interested in market-driven education should be watching New Orleans. And there was a flood of corporate foundation money to help prop up some of the charter schools that were able to set up. But by and large, this was something that the state had to intervene in. The situation, was this kind of disaster response center cartoon when we knew what we needed, but what we got in return was a lot of political spin doctors, ideologues, privatizers who were trying to take advantage of what was a real human tragedy to push forward on some key market-led reforms.